I'm Mike Jones from the Federated Identity team. I'd like to welcome you diehards to the last session of MIX. Given we're a small group, let's keep it fairly informal. So I'd like to do a poll before we actually really start on the content. How many of you have ever used an OpenID knowingly? Okay, about 2/3. How many have used one in the last week? 3. How many today? Okay. Well, what I'm going to be talking about is some incubation efforts that I've done with some other companies in the industry to look at both usability and security issues with OpenID and how we can make it better. So I didn't want to start by assuming that everyone knew what it was. So for the first few minutes, I'll actually run you through some demos of what OpenID is, demonstrating both some of the usability and security issues that the rest of the talk will be about addressing. And rather than giving you death by PowerPoint, mostly we're going to give you demos so that you can see things. And feel free to hop to the mic and ask questions if something's not clear during it. So what's an OpenID? An OpenID is a single sign-on technology that was originally developed for the use case of leaving comments on blogs so that you could know who it was that was commenting and have some authority that it was Mike Jones rather than, fake Michael Jackson or something. And indeed, we're taking a bet that this could become the single sign-on technology for the internet and a way of releasing information about you. So this is fairly important. Now, syntactically, an OpenID today is nothing but a URL. And it's a special URL that in some way I can control or I can prove that I can log into. So because I'm in the space, I have a bunch. I've got my blog, I've got some at partner sites, I've got one at Yahoo, I've got one at Google. And before I show you the first demo, this is the slide Vittoria wanted me to put in. Hello, Vittoria. Showing you, in some sense, what the flow is of using an OpenID. I visit a website. The user chooses to sign in with an OpenID. And at that point, the relying party, the website, redirects you to that URL, which is the OpenID that you control. You sign in, step 4, to that site. At that point, if you've successfully signed in, the OpenID site redirects you back where you came from with a security token that's signed with credentials proving that you were able to sign in there. And finally, you're signed in. And using this OpenID account, an ID I have somewhere else, rather than one more username and password that I happen to have on the native site. So let's show the basic blog comment scenario, since that's where all this started. So I have a friend, Paul Madsen, who is active in the identity world, and he's also Canadian. He's fond of making pithy blog comments about current events. So Paul, without going into all the humor, there's all these Venn diagrams in the space trying to show how everything relates to everything else. And he made an Olympic Venn diagram during the recent Olympics. So I think I want to say something to Paul about that. I'll make a blog comment. So post a comment. I'll say to Paul, and I'd like Paul to know who I am. And I could either use, it turns out, a Google account if I wanted to, or Blogger supports OpenID. And I could use any of the OpenIDs that I showed you or others. I'm actually going to use my blog because I want the reference to my comment to refer back to my blog. So I'll publish my comment. But in order to have the comment be validated, I have to sign in to my OpenID, and assuming the network comes up. Okay, so my blog, I've actually delegated it to a more legitimate OpenID provider, somebody that runs a service for me, signon.com, run by Ping Identity. And I'll sign on there. This is proving that I own the blog URL. And lo and behold, my comment's been saved and will be visible after the blog owner approves. So he's moderating comments, probably a wise decision. But at that point, I've left a comment request using my OpenID. That's the basic use case that was the motivating example for the technology. So you saw me type in that blog URL, and some of the blog URLs are worse than that. The Google one has a bunch of long characters in it. The user experience studies have shown that fewer than about 5% of the population is able to successfully get through an OpenID sign-in experience where they have to type in a URL. So that's not great. So the way the industry's improved that is the relying parties start putting logos of different potential identity providers on their sites. And this is an actual set of logos found on one site. And you know, this is easier to use demonstrably. So let's show you what it's like to actually use one of these, what they call NASCAR screens. So Plaxo is a social networking site that is currently owned by Comcast. Some of you may have accounts there. And they have a little NASCAR screen. It's called NASCAR, by the way, because if you look at a NASCAR car or the driver's uniforms, they're plastered with logos. And you just run out of space. And indeed, this is the way the web would become if we tried to put every identity provider up there. And indeed, the interesting thing about OpenID is you could use any site, maybe your university, maybe your company as an OpenID provider. And so while there's a few big ones like Google and Yahoo, I may want to use completely different ones, and there's probably not enough space for the NASCAR. Plaxo went fairly small. They have partnerships with Yahoo and Google. And so clicking the Google logo sends me over to Google Sign In. It's saying Plaxo wants me to sign in. So I'll go ahead and do that. Okay, and having done that, I'm now signed into Plaxo, but with a Google OpenID rather than with a native username password at Plaxo. And you can see some of people's comments and my identity attributes here. So that's the NASCAR experience. That's a little better. But again, it has the problem. For instance, I've talked to some of the people in the industry who are hosting sites. Yeah, the big sites may have logos here, but you can bet that University of Washington or Arizona State University or University of Nevada at Las Vegas are not going to be in the NASCAR screen, even if that's where your identity happens to be hosted. Now let's get to the dark side. One of the problems with using identities in more than one place is it increases the value of that identity for people who would like to have it be stolen. And I'm actually going to take the liberty of letting you watch one of my identities be stolen now. So there's a fun little, well, fun for those of us who are identity geeks, fun little fun little demonstration site run by a company called Fun Communications in Germany that is an OpenID phishing demo site. This is a relying party, and it does have a NASCAR, but I'm just going to type a OpenID that I happen to control into it to sign in. And what a good OpenID relying party does is it redirects you to that site for you to sign in. So I'm telling it where my identity provider is. Now let's watch it do the redirect. And we're bouncing from Las Vegas to Germany and through some number of routers. All right, so I'm redirected to VeriSign's identity provider and prepared to log in. And I'll go right ahead and do that. Now, how many of you noticed up here in the URL, Mary did, that I'm not at VeriSign? I'm actually at a site which was screen scraped from the VeriSign identity provider site. And it's very clever. It even has the site title correct. It's got the little favicon, the site icon. So unless I'm really, really looking, it looks just like my VeriSign login. In fact, I'll go ahead and log in, having been fooled. Oh, must have mistyped. Let me try again. All right. And, you know, VeriSign gives me the option to even protect my identity with a one-time password. So let's generate one of those, and I'll type it in. Still being at the phishing site. Now, VeriSign has an older interface for giving me explicit control over what claims I'll release, giving me lots of control. So I'll give it my full name, my nickname, my email address, which the relying party was asking for. And I'll say just sign in once. Say allow. And I'm signed in to the phishing site. Oh, and I can even see, this is the way I mistyped my password the first time. Instead of typing fish for me, I typed fish M3. This was the OTP value which I typed. And were this a valuable session that I'd logged into, such as a bank account or something that the attacker actually wanted, even though I protected this particular login with an OTP, they still have my session and can do whatever they want. So the thing that I wanted you to see there is just how realistic the phishing attacks can be. And you know, this was a weekend project for a clever guy in Germany using a toolkit. This wasn't rocket science to achieve. So what have we seen so far? We've seen that basic OpenID interaction requires people remembering URLs, which doesn't work very well for most people. We've seen that the NASCAR experience where you click on a button is easier, but it doesn't scale particularly well, just like there's limited space on the NASCAR car, or really facilitate choice of identity providers other than those anticipated by the relying party. And we've seen that phishing is scarily easy to accomplish. So that's the before. Now we'll get to the after part of the talk. A number of people in the OpenID community have speculated that building an active client, a piece of software that helps you manage and supervise your identity interactions online, could both make it easier to use, facilitate choice, and potentially guard you from going to places that you really didn't intend to go, like that phishing OP that I showed you. So let's show that in action. I'm going to show you now the first time use of an OpenID provider. And let me close that other session just to make sure any cookies that were there are gone. So I'm going to go back to Plaxo and sign in with an OpenID. Oh, I am still signed in. Okay. Only this time I'm going to use an OpenID with, let's try again. Using an active client to help supervise the interaction. So this is a prototype version of the Windows card space selector, which many of you would know would supervise information cards, and now we've added an OpenID capability to it too. Now, one of our goals was that the first time use should sort of be no worse than the experience without it. So what you see here is the site was able to suggest, even though I don't have any identities that I've remembered, the site's suggesting, well, you could use Google or Yahoo or a provider called myopenid.com from Janrain, sort of the equivalent of the NASCAR experience. So last time I showed you logging in with Google, I'll do so here again. So what happened there is it followed the URL, it did discovery on Google's OpenID identifier. In a production version of it, there would be an OpenID standard to go get the logo to help people be familiar with it. And it's going to remember this identity for me in the future if I want. So I'll say, okay, I'll use my Google OpenID at Plaxo. And I think I'm going to have to close all the browsers for you to see it. But many of you have used OpenID. You're going to have to trust me that that went to Google. Google remembered from some session state that I was signed in, and it redirected me back here, and I'm logged in using my Google OpenID. So now we close all the browsers so I won't have to fake any of this anymore. Okay, I think all my browsers are, nope. I think IE8 is remembering session cookies across sessions. Okay, clean browser. Let's go use it at the second time and see what that looks like. Okay, not signed in. I'll invoke the selector again. Well, this time it's remembering that the last ID I used was Google here. It's telling me I last used it at 3:16 this afternoon. And I can just one click to get to the site. And because I didn't have a session cookie this time, I am shown the redirection. All right, and so that was using my Google OpenID using the selector. So let's sign out. Now remember, one of the things that I said was sort of a problem though with the NASCAR experience is there was only a limited number of choices. What if I wanted to use an OpenID that wasn't in the set of choices? So let's show that with the selector. I'll click this Other OpenIDs, and remember my blog URL again. And I'll enter that as an identity to remember. I'll verify it, which means it's doing discovery on it. Now this time, the user experience is putting a speed bump in my way. It tried to look up self-issued.info in a whitelist of trusted identity providers. Given it's a personal blog URL, it wasn't there in a trusted list. So before it's even going to let me use it, I'm going to have to click Continue I Trust This identifier. Now notice I could have used the Google one here again just by clicking, but I do want to start using my vanity URL as my OpenID identifier. So I'll say OK. And I'm redirected again to sign on. Allow once. And I'm signed in again. Voila. Now, let me show you the aspect of choice that's sort of fun about that now. Let's go to another relying party and invoke the selector. Different site, but it's still remembering, oh, I've got my Google OpenID, and it's remembering that I have my personal OpenID, and it's this remembering the personal one, the one that I actually want to use most of the time, which is one of the usability improvements. So at this point, I can sign into this other test site using my vanity URL. And non-successful auth response was received. Oh, that's right. I remember that there's an incompatibility between this provider and this site. You know, and the technology still has its wrinkles around the edges. I think the Google one, which I've never used here before, is going to be compatible with the site. Yes, it was. So anyway, let's go ahead back to the deck for a minute. So you saw the second time use where it remembered the OpenID that I used the last time, and it told me when I used it. You saw me using a personal OpenID, and indeed that it remembered it, that I can bring them with me to the site. You also saw that it's telling me at each site that I visit when I last used the identity, or indeed if I never did. So going back to the phishing example, supposing I was being tricked into trying to use my VeriSign OpenID at a site, but I'd never actually used it there before. At that point, the selector would be warning me saying, you've never used this here, do you really want to do this? And it's one of the ways of putting up a guard for you against potentially malicious sites. So in summary, what you've seen is an effort to both improve the usability of OpenID by remembering my identities for me and bringing them with me to the sites, as well as to improve the security of the OpenID experience by having the OpenID selector warn me if I'm going to a place that either isn't known to be good, or indeed warn me, you've never been here before with this ID, do you want to proceed? Which we've found to be, I think, a reasonable trade-off between security and usability. So what's the status of this work? As I said at the beginning of the talk, this is an incubation. One of the interesting aspects of it is there's not yet an OpenID standard for how a relying party advertises that it can accept or that it can use a selector. And so in order for this to come true, we and others will have to work together in order to develop such a thing, so that you could get a Firefox plugin which does this, or a Chrome plugin which does it, or indeed maybe one from IE someday that will do it to help you out. We demoed this to folks both at the Internet Identity Workshop in November and an OpenID Summit that was associated with it. And it was reasonably well received, and indeed it was part of what made people put the notion of an active client for OpenID on the roadmap for what to look at for the next version of OpenID, and that work is starting to happen. I'm involved both as Microsoft's representative to the OpenID Foundation, as well as someone doing technical standards work in the area. I'd be glad to be talking with any of you about your reactions to this, or indeed what you'd like to see happen with this work. I've actually finished on time and would be glad to have a conversation with you now. Go ahead.
Just as an example that you gave, what did the relying party need to do for your example for your plugin to identify it as?
Yes, I'll repeat the question. And I'll actually show you the answer. What the question was, is what did the relying party have to do in order to tell the selector that it could be activated. And I'll show you by actually showing you the live code on Plaxo's site. So this is Plaxo's sign in with the OpenID page. And we'll use the handy view source. Alrighty. So if I type Control+, does it get bigger? No, okay. What you have here, I'll scroll the relevant part to the top, is syntax called an object tag, which is something we borrowed using tools we had lying around the house, if you will, for the demo. That this is a variant of the same object tag that's used to invoke information cards, but with a different parameter set. In this case, we're saying the protocol to use is OpenID 2.0. The token type to release, rather than SAML, is OpenID token. There's a set of issuers that Plaxo is saying that they're willing to accept or to suggest. In this case, the cryptic Google URL, Yahoo, and my OpenID. Parameters saying whether this is an exclusive or just a suggested list. And then there's a grab bag of OpenID authentication parameters that are passed, which are used to form the OpenID authentication request message. So we imagine that any syntax developed by the actual OpenID standards process will have to be able to communicate all this same information. You know, the particulars may differ depending upon what people decide. Good? Any other questions? Yes?
Apply to AJAX or REST service scenarios?
The question is, how does this apply to AJAX or REST service scenarios? In some sense, this applies to any web authentication scenarios. So in the grandest scheme, you could imagine that any place today on the web where you might be asked to type a username or password to log in, that instead the site could accept third-party identity using OpenID rather than requiring you to create your own username and password. And so the particular method of passing the OpenID parameters happens to be fairly RESTful, but it's actually applicable to sites built using any technology, you know, PHP, Java, Ruby, you name it.
So you had Silverlight client, for instance?
Yeah, indeed. You could use OpenID authentication at Silverlight sites just as easily as you could at a PHP site. Any other questions? Well, I'd like to thank you for staying to the very end of MIX and having this conversation with us about potential future of authentication on the web. Thank you very much.